I don't want to wait anymore. I hope you guys had a great week. Thank you for submitting your assignments. I'm getting through them little by little. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, I do have the chat room up and I can see your comments. Sometimes I get a little involved in speaking, so please forgive me if I miss your question. I've allowed you guys to unmute yourself, so if you need to interrupt me, please do so. I hope you find Zoom a little bit more engaging and easier to use than WebEx. I find it a lot more user-friendly, so hopefully it will be a much smoother ride this week, this time around. So I wanted to start with just some basic info about the assignments due, etc. I did update the syllabus to include Zoom instead of WebEx, and I believe I've updated the course as well. I did update one more thing on the syllabus. I noticed as I was going through the getting ready for tonight that the project overview and the overall final project had 3 peer-reviewed sources instead of 5, but the project does, the completed project does require 5. And we'll talk about the project overview this evening a little bit. And then I'll have open questions at the end, as I promised. So our presentation should be, or meeting should be about an hour, and then I'll have some time afterward to, discuss stuff individually with you guys, or just a general class Q&A. So I wanted to just, since we're going to get started, in more discussion questions throughout the, semester. I think you guys did really well on the andragogy discussion. I did read through, I think, most of them as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. I made comments on some of them. I do read through all of them, and I want to participate in the discussions, but just because I don't reply to you in the actual class forum doesn't mean that I'm not reading your posts or I'm not interested in them. It's just sometimes I'd rather just comment to you individually. So I am going through those within, the next few days. And again, if you have any questions about any of my comments or any of the grades or anything, please reach out. So this is in the discussion questions that you see on this particular slide are in your syllabus. I just wanted to remind you guys, if you get stuck on, the types of things that you want to, bring up or you want to comment on, there are some guiding questions for you included in the syllabus that you can pretty much utilize for any of the topics that we talk about. So just read through them, and most of you are doing great. I just wanted to show you this particular information and resource in case any particular topics are a little bit harder to engage in, or you're really having a long day and you just want to just have an easy prompt to, kind of base your posts on, or your responses to your peers. So here are just some easy questions. I included it in tonight. So if you, refer to our tonight's lecture, you have them here for you. So just some general things, you don't have to use these by any means to respond to your colleagues. You guys are doing great. Like I said, the first post looked really good. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about the project overview and just a little bit of information on peer-reviewed versus reputable sources. A couple of you had questions, hence why I included some information on that announcement I sent over a few days ago. So just the difference between peer-reviewed versus a reputable source, both are good, but which one do you want to use for your paper? The ones that we're referring to when I actually ask you for your project overview or for your final project, when I say peer-reviewed, those are articles that are formally submitted to an academic journal, and they're reviewed by a panel of experts on the topic, and they're accepted into the journal and published therefore. So there's a little bit of difference between peer-reviewed and reputable sources. A reputable source is pretty much anything that you find online or in the form of an article that's not peer-reviewed, but contains an authored source, meaning someone taking, responsibility for the stuff they're putting out there. It could be in the format of a non-for-profit or a university website, or just these general, Psychology Today, those types of, sometimes they put articles out that are just published by the actual magazine or entity. So I'm okay with any source that you use as long as it's authored, it's coming from a reputable place, it's recent, it's current. I'm not too concerned with the actual sources that you use. Definitely for your journal entries, I think the one that you actually included this week, even though it wasn't required, I do appreciate you guys going the extra mile and adding those to your postings. I really appreciate that. Those don't necessarily need to be peer reviewed. If you'd like them to be, fantastic. If not, as long as they're from a good, reliable source, I'm good with that. For your discussion questions, same rule. If they're peer reviewed, great. Again, the peer reviewed journals are things that you get out of the library, Barry or any of the public libraries, anything that's included in a journal database. You can find them through Google Scholar. I know I shared some online databases with you. Sometimes you'll find a really good article on Google Scholar, but it'll ask you to pay money for it. Please don't pay any money for any of the articles you find on Google Scholar, because I'm pretty sure that Barry University has them in their database. And if they don't, and you really, really want, the source and you just can't locate it, I can always look for you over at FIU and see if they have it there. But please don't spend money on articles. There's a way around finding them, whether it's through Barry or some other means, but please let me know. So for the project overview, so we're officially beginning the journey towards our final projects this week. Hopefully you've been reading through, last module's materials and this module 2, which we'll talk about next week. I will touch upon some of the things in module 2 tonight, so I'll give you a little bit of foreshadowing. So you'll have a foundation when you see some of those terms or some of those folks that we're going to read about in module 2 tonight. So the project overview is really just for you, as well as me, more for you, to get a grasp on what types of things you guys want to look at in more depth. So I got a really good idea of what you guys are interested in some of your journal entries. I made very specific, comments to some of you. I think all of you are on the right track, but the project overview is essentially, you're going to do kind of like a formal type of brainstorming in about 2 to 3 pages, double spaced, of course. You're going to discuss, pick a topic. It doesn't have to be 100% set in stone, but a general topic, like, or do you want to look at a theory? Do you want to look at a particular theorist? Do you want to look at a method? So you want to choose the type of project that you want to focus on. So last week we talked about the 3 different: a scholarly paper, a position paper, or a teaching methodology. Again, we have about 7 weeks left in our, maybe even less than that, for the final project to be due. So things change from now till then. So the project overview should really just focus on the topic you want to get into and the type of paper that you're, planning on working on. Certainly a scholarly paper could easily turn into a position paper and vice versa. And then a teaching methodology can easily have a position in it. So none of these are, in their own little category. They kind of overlap. So as long as it's a good resource paper, it's well written, it's well put together, and there's thought and just, your analysis in it, that's really what I'm looking for. So you're going to talk about your interest in this particular topic. What you currently know about this matter. You're not supposed to be a subject matter expert yet. Hopefully by the time you finish your project, you will be sort of a subject matter expert, at least know a lot more about the topic or the theorist or the method or the teaching theory that you're looking at, more than you're currently starting off now. Perhaps it's something that you're currently, doing in your existing position, either professionally or maybe you've heard of something in another class you took, and you want to kind of do a more in-depth look at it here. So why you're interested in the topic, what you already know about the matter, what you want to accomplish in your paper, what you want to learn, that's also applicable here, and how you think this accomplishment, of course, might impact your life or work. So as you've all so eloquently shared in your initial discussion post on Andragogy today, we all know some of the basic concepts of it, and I'm trying to practice what I preach in here and allowing you to definitely make whatever you do for my class relevant to your own either job or your academic goals, or whatever the case may be in your particular situation. You're required to have 5 sources in this particular project overview. They can change over time. I just want you to have complete the exercise of looking for information on your particular topic, and cite it, and have a familiarity with maybe some names or important people in the area that you're looking at. They do not have to be the same by the end of the semester when you turn in your final projects. They could change, they could be more. I'm just asking for a minimum of 5. So again, they could be different, they could be the same, they could be, you can add more information. Just remember one thing: when you're citing sources when you list sources in your references, right? I'm going to review a little bit of APA, not tonight, but in a couple of weeks when we're getting, closer to the actual final presentation and the final paper submittal. When you list sources in your references page, okay, that's the last page of your in APA style. Some of you might call it a bibliography. Some of you may know it as a works cited, depending on your background. In APA, it's references, and formally a references page only lists those sources that you have used and cited in your work. So if you have an article or you read a book on the topic and it gave you a lot of information, or you became enlightened with that, but you're not really citing it, there are different types of references type documents and sections to the paper that you can add, like a works consulted, for example, if you want to give credit to something. But officially a references page is going to contain those sources that you actually cite in your paper. Okay, so those authors, those organizations, and that sort of thing. Okay, so for the project overview, when I say APA style, I'm expecting to have a cover page, your citations in text to have the author's last names with the dates. Remember, page numbers in APA style are optional unless you're doing a direct quote. So if you're paraphrasing or you're summarizing something, you don't need to add a page number necessarily. Most professors would like you to add a page number for specificity, but it's not required under APA. So we'll brush up on our APA style, like I said, in a few weeks when we're getting closer to the final paper. So if you have any questions, the chat is open. I'm going to just wait a couple of seconds to see if anybody has any overall questions about the project overview. Again, you can always, contact me on inbox. I'm pretty good. Hopefully you guys think I'm pretty good at getting back to you. I tried my best to always be on top of messages from you. So if any of you also, if you haven't navigated Barry's library and you want some more information, there are a number of things we can do. Just reach out to me. We can put you in contact with one of our reference librarians. There are some library guides available to you by subject matter. And there are databases that you can search through, either through the journal name, or the author, or the topic. So there's various ways of you locating these types of sources in the library. And if you need just a quick refresher, reach out to me and I'll be sure to make sure that you get the information or the help that you need. Okay, so moving right along, I think most of you have already figured out what the definition of andragogy is and what a theory is, a conceptual framework of looking at a particular idea or concept that we try to use to explain the world's phenomenon. And in specific terms, andragogy is defined as the set of core principles that we as adults use and appreciate being used while we're learning or acquiring knowledge. So there's 2 processes in learning. There's my job, which is delivering the information in an effective way, and then you as a student receiving the information in the best way that you know how to. For the purposes of this course, we're kind of going to use those interchangeably. We're going to look at the best way that you as a trainer or as a teacher or as an educator can deliver information to your students or your trainees or your employees to have them, better understand where you're coming from. And some of the comments that I made today and some of your journal reflections and in the discussion forum, I mentioned, inclusivity and, multiple intelligences. Those are all part of that, taking that into consideration when you're either developing a lesson or a lecture or even developing an assessment or an assignment for your students or your employees, if you're conducting training. So the transactional model means a transaction like when you go to a bank and you withdraw money or you deposit money. It's seen as a two-way street. It's seen as me enabling you. I'm not going to say giving you information, because I think at this point in our life as learners, we realize that the banking system, for those of you that are familiar with Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, we're not, you know, receptacles. We need more than just to receive knowledge in order to understand it. So it's the process of learning, not necessarily the acquisition of knowledge, that we're going to be focusing on in this particular course. A few other factors affecting learning. Of course, I think we've all seen this in what we've read in a few of the slides in the very long PowerPoint presentation. This week it wasn't too long. Next week it's a little bit longer, but some of those concepts that they covered in summarizing the materials for the week are individual learning preferences, and we'll talk about learning preferences a little bit more in depth next week, and why people are skeptical, and what you guys think about that, you know, that philosophy of, you know, you're a better visual learner or kinesthetic learner. Are those things set in stone? Are those things changing? Were you a better, you know, maybe visual learner when you were younger, but now you really prefer to read something and write it down, you know? So maybe is that changing based on the situation? So again, all those things are part of the learning process. And of course, the goals and purpose of learning. All of you are here for a purpose. Some of you want to change careers. Some of you want to advance. Some of you are coming back to school to see kind of where you're headed in the next stage of life. So again, the purpose and the situation of where we are as learners. So this is the graph that, you know, that I guess the image that we see in our textbook and also in the PowerPoint presentation for the week. And it kind of shows a holistic you know, image of how Malcolm Knowles envisioned learning for adults. And I guess, you know, based on the loose interpretation or definition of what an adult learner is, I think most of us can attest to the fact that it's changed quite a bit since we were in high school, perhaps, to what we're doing now. I think the majority of students, I mean, it used to be defined by 25 and older, you know, and all these different stipulations. And while that might be true, I think a lot of us can realize, maybe for our own children or some of our siblings or maybe our nephews and nieces, that an adult learner really encompasses a wider realm of learners. It's students that are in high school, possibly, you know, taking care of their sick parent, or they're single parents that are still in high school. So it's more situational, I think, than age-related. As many of us know that had children earlier in life, when we have children or when we take on responsibilities like taking care of a sick parent, or, you know, being presented in life with difficult situations, we grow up pretty fast. So, you know, I like to define adult learning as a student that's not in your typical, you know, living at home with mom and dad, maybe having a part-time job, having the basic necessities met, and not in a luxurious way, or we're not talking about socioeconomic class. I'm talking about any student that has the foundation at home, has the support of his or her parents, that is pretty much taking care of the majority of their needs, without having to impose so much on, you know, their sons or daughters' lives insofar as school. So anybody that falls out of that realm, whether you're working full-time to pay the bills, whether you're living on your own, whether you're married at a young age, whether you have children, or you're taking care of a sibling because your parents are ill, or whatever the case is, you know, that is what I envision as being an adult learner, a non-traditional, you know, type of student. And how do we define that? The adult learner is someone who has an independent self-concept, who can direct his or her own learning. So we decide, you know, how we learn best, where we want to take our learning, how we see ourselves as learners, you know, more sophisticated ways of thinking about ourselves, not only as sitting in this class, you know, taking exams or doing papers, but as a whole. How is the stuff we learn in here going to make me a better educator, make me a better student, make me a better mom even, you know? So again, the fact that we as adult learners have accumulated a reservoir of life experiences, and we've seen this over and over, not only in this week's lessons, but in life. Without our experiential knowledge, we probably wouldn't be sitting in this classroom right now if we couldn't relate what you're learning in this class and maybe other classes you're taking in the program to your own personal lives. And I think every single one of you in here based on your introductions earlier, last week, you shared the fact that you're here because of, because you feel like it's pertinent to your life at this moment. And as we've seen through many of the theorists that we've looked at, or this week that we've read about, it's all based on situation. Okay, give or take. Some people have this take on it, and some people have this other take on it. But for the most part, learning in an adult's life is based on the need for knowledge, based on the situation. It's also related to changing social roles. When do we really become mature? When do we decide what type of learning is appropriate? Sometimes it could be a change in profession. Sometimes it could be a life-changing experience. You get married, or you have a child, or a parent passes away, or a sibling, God forbid, passes away. So it's problem-centered, and it's constantly related to what our roles in society. And I think through the readings this week, if you focus on the humanistic aspect of psychology and learning, we are who we are based on social roles and our interactions with other learners and other people in society. If any of you are philosophy buffs, I love existentialism, but this is basically existentialistic thought. Jean-Paul Sartre, some of the other French philosophers from the 60s and 70s that really tapped into this idea that we are who we are based on our relationships with others. We don't live and exist solipsistically. We don't live and exist alone. We are who we are based on what we do and interact with, who we interact with on a daily basis. And again, motivation is a huge part of adult learning. We're motivated by the internal rather than the external. Some of the early psychology theories focused on, stimuli response versus, responding versus, to stimuli versus what we feel inside. So actual external things we crave or we see or we can relate to drives our impulses to act or behave in a certain way. So that's different than what we supposedly, as we mature as adult learners, we change those external factors to more intrinsic factors. The fact that you want to be a better person, or you want to be more well-rounded. And, sometimes maybe some of you took a course, or, listened to a TED Talk just because you wanted to be a better person, or you're reading a self-help book. So again, those intrinsic factors versus then, it's not always about money and not always about salary. I'm sure some of us have had positions or jobs that we don't get paid that well, but the benefits are so amazing, and the people we work with are so amazing, and the people that we help are so amazing. None of us are in education. I always say we take a vow of poverty sometimes when we're educators. We're not in it for the money. We're in it for the I guess the intrinsic reward in our hearts, that we feel that we accomplished something, we did something good. So it all sounds really nice and really utopian, but there are people that have criticized Malcolm Knowles and this whole idea of the holistic kind of learner and the core learning principles, by saying it's not a theory, but instead it's just a set of practices. It's just a natural way of seeing things. It's not really considered to be a theory. And andragogy in general has a lot of criticism, as we've seen throughout some of the things we've read about and encountered in the last couple of weeks. So one of the things we're going to look at in this course is, what is andragogy? Is it really, really different from the way, other types of people learn, younger children? Do we have to draw such a vast difference between, our children in school versus ourselves? And then, I did mention mention that to a few of you in your reflections, insofar as maybe the school system, the way it's set up to kind of deliver knowledge to students, is not really the way we want to go. Maybe we want to approach learning in secondary education like we approach a little bit more like adult learning, where we have the students discover and engage and not be so focused on all of this examination and testing that regardless of how you feel about it, it's a lot of stress and anxiety that we put on not only the teachers, but also especially the students also. Some other criticism of these assumptions are not limited to adult learners, but again, they also play a role in pedagogy, such as motivation. My daughter's 5, she's in kindergarten, and every day she tries her darn hardest to get as many points as she can, because she wants to go and get a little treat from the treasure box, and that keeps her going and that keeps her motivated. And sometimes, with children, the motivation and the rewards need to be a little bit more tangible. But children are like, I believe they're like little adults. If we treat them like little adults in the sense that we reward them with time and with an experience versus a toy or a present, they will be just as happy and maybe even feel more rewarded. So, eventually andragogy, I guess through time, became to be associated with learning with situation and not necessarily with who you are as a person, but how you're functioning in a particular time and space and time. So we look at two different types of psychology or philosophy when we begin thinking about andragogy, those more biological or elemental types of ways of approaching learning. And then we have the humanistic side. Obviously, the humanistic side is more of what we want to focus on as adult learners, and hopefully where we're moving with education in the future. And hopefully technology will aid in that fact where we are able to go beyond just what's in the classroom or what's in what's in the present moment, and move into the future and explore what's going on globally and be exposed to different perspectives. So humanistic philosophy of psychology, was influenced by existential philosophy and phenomenology, as I mentioned. Maslow in 1940 wrote The Theory of Human Motivation. That was a staple in the beginning foundation of adult learning theory. And I think all of you, not all of you, most of you talked about Carl Rogers in your postings. Both, Carl Rogers and his client-centered therapy of the 1950s, both, philosophers, psychologists agree that topics such as self-actualization, creativity, individualism, and related topics were really the central themes of this new approach. For the first time, since, the early 1900s, the student or the client became the center versus, the instructor or the psychologist or the expert in the field. And it was Rogers, of course, as you all know, established that client-centered approach that influenced the thinkers of the 1960s and 70s. So this concept of personal involvement, we are part of the learning process. Like I said in my introduction to the course last week, I want you to bring in information. I want you to bring in different perspectives. I thought some of the new sources and resources that you brought into the discussion in the Andragogy Forum were amazing. Imagination, the longitudinal study that I forget who it is, but she brought it up, insofar as, studying folks that came from, an advanced kind of educational system, maybe comparing those students' motivational factors with students that don't have access to education and those sorts of things, minorities and women and other disadvantaged groups. So, but both Maslow and Rogers agreed that all these topics were essential to the learning process. So I want to just take a brief pause here, and you guys please make use of the chat box. Just a few questions to kind of get us motivated. I know it's the night before Halloween, it's late, but I just want to maybe a couple of you to, shout out and just think about, on a personal experience, maybe something you've experienced this week or last week, related to, work or home life or academics, that you saw, maybe something that you read in class, that you said, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, some of you, by the very nature of participating in this course, as I mentioned to some of you in your responses, are living, breathing examples of andragogy. So, what do you guys think? Are there any experiences, personal experience, that you've kind of experienced this last week that you might be able to relate to something that we've learned about in class? Maybe a student that you needed to teach something to. I know some of you are already in the education field. A couple of you are, Scott, I know you work in athletics. Are there any maybe elements in this particular course that you've actually seen, play out in your everyday life? So if you guys could share, that would be really great.
Hi, Dr. Stefano.
Go ahead, Marie. Just something real fast. If you want to unmute and just talk, you may do that, or you can write in the chat box, whatever you feel. Okay.
So my job really focuses on the adult
Let me
learners. Like,
see. Are you able to unmute yourself, or do you want me to do it on my end?
oh, I thought I muted myself.
You should be able to.
Can you hear me?
Oops.
Can you hear me?
Okay, great.
Okay. So at my job.
Okay, so did you guys feel a little bit more comfortable with chatting? Just, maybe just a couple of words. Just share. Okay, so Marie, what was something that you experienced this week that you might be able to relate to something in class?
So
A lesson, a student.
Right. At my job,
I'll give you guys a few minutes to type. I know it takes a little bit longer to type. Let me see. I'm going to go ahead and unmute. Okay, so let me see. I'm going to have to do this because my cursor is not showing on the screen. So I'm going to do one by one. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Marie. Okay, hold on. Let me see. Let me exit this real quick and change the settings to this. I see. Let me go ahead and give me 1 second. I'm going to go ahead and unmute the group. There we go. Okay, so I see what you're typing. I'm just going to try to unmute you guys. So you have more of a, oh, here we go. Okay. So Marie, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. I should be able to unmute all of you. Okay. Okay, so all of you are unmuted. If you want to mute yourself, all your mics are working. So I'm just going to pause the presentation now and have you guys share. So Marie, one of your students was having an issue with the computers and a younger student assisted her. Okay.
Yeah.
So how is that something that we can relate to in class today?
Most of the most of the students at my job are working students. So our classes start.
I can't hear you.
I think everyone else can hear me, right?
Okay. Try now, Marie.
Can you hear me?
Yes, finally. Yay. Okay, great. Okay, go ahead.
So at my job, we cater to the working adults. So all of our classes actually start at 6:15. So during the day, it's like really dead and quiet. So like the students will come in and work on projects or whatever. So the one student was actually getting frustrated because she had no idea how to like use the technology that we have, and we're currently updating the technology. So that was one thing that she was really frustrated with, and most of the older crowd tends to get frustrated with the technology, especially that we have at our campus.
Understandably.
Yeah. But one of the younger students actually helped her out, and which she didn't have to, but she did, and she understood. So she had told me, and I sit next to the IT person, so I told him.
And I think, Marie, it's really fascinating to see how the different generations kind of work together.
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a great example. I'm so glad you brought that up. So yeah, it's like what I said, it's not always about like grouping people into like, oh, you're a traditional learner, you're this, you're that. I think it's great because technology we all share. Yeah. All right. So awesome. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody, and then I'm going to unmute you when you're ready. Okay. So anyone else? So when you're done sharing, you can mute yourself and then you can unmute yourself.
Dr. Stefano, this is Scott. Can you hear me?
I could. Nerly, can you mute your microphone for now, Nerly, please? Let me see if I can mute her. Okay. He's having too much fun over here.
Yeah.
Okay, Scott, go ahead.
Okay. I haven't fully read the chapters yet. I'm halfway through. I just finished the first chapter, but I did find it kind of interesting where they were talking about how some nowadays they're trying to take some of the andragological principles and assumptions, et cetera, and trying to adapt it to younger students and the pedagogy as far as motivation, and having them do group projects, maybe some self-directed projects as well. My son we have to now look at junior high or middle school now.
Oh.
And my wife actually went to, I guess they have tours now, which is new to us. So this middle school, it's a lot of group projects, a lot of, to me, they're treating the students, they're treating the students more as little adults in the sense of learning. And I kind of found that kind of interesting. As well as, I kind of removed myself from athletics. I'm in the classroom full time now. And today I'm trying to take some of the principles that I'm reading from your class, and I'm very, very anxious and interested in this class to help me further my professorial classroom teaching. So I'm asking the students, hey, how would you want to go about learning this, and trying to figure them out and what motivates them, etc. So, I mean, that's just my little 2 cents that kind of made a light bulb click in my head this afternoon with the couple things that I experienced today.
That's amazing. And one of the you just mentioned, I love the idea of the inclusive classroom one. I just want to clarify, when I say inclusive, I don't mean like differentiated learning in the sense that we do like, EAPs or learning plans for students with varying exception. I'm talking about inclusivity insofar as taking into account, students' background, where they're coming from. The other day I used an example, very specific example. If you're teaching a religion course, okay, and you're talking about the symbolism of, let's say, the white dove, assuming that most of you are Judeo-Christian, we all know, we're brought up thinking, oh yeah, the white dove, it means peace, or water means purity. And, I had this one student, and she was from Bangladesh, and she had no idea what this was taught. We were looking at a piece of literature, and she was like, Ms. Stefano, what does this mean? And it dawned on me that without knowing, we automatically assume, because we're coming from most of us, now I'm not saying, I don't know, all of that of you coming from a Western perspective, I'm assuming that most of us are, we don't take that into consideration. So Scott, your example is perfect, taking into account, where they're coming from, if they're single parents, how old they are. So absolutely. And that comes back to Marie's example of like the younger student helping the older student. So yeah, I mean, that's awesome. And I really, really praise you for that. It's a hard job, Scott. It's hard to kind of teach to the learner and modify an assignment. It's hard. It's more work for us. That's why a lot of professors are like, just write the paper, So I hear you. Absolutely. Cool. Anyone else want to share something real quick before we move on to the next question? All right. Okay. All right, cool. So I'm going to skip 2 and move to 3. This one was something that I thought about because I was reading up on our discussion tonight, and I wanted to add a couple of extra things. So this is interesting. Can you think of some human stages in life, okay, that influence learning? And it came to mind because I was reading this presentation by another professor on similar topics that we're covering here. And I thought about milestones, and a lot of you like Jung, and you talked about Jung and the archetypes, and this came to my mind like biological, stages of life where we learn, or legal, the whole age of 21 to drink, or age to like to drive, or how about other things that affect our learning? Can you think of, the whole age of reason? If you guys are Christian and you're the whole age of reason, how does that influence how we think and how we learn? What do you guys think? Have you thought about that? Maybe marriage? Was marriage a wake-up call for any of you? Hold on, let me unmute you guys. Let's see, I think. I can't tell. Jasmanda, are you speaking? I can't see a little microphone. Let me go ahead and. Okay. Yeah, the sound goes in and out. You should be able to unmute yourself. So, So yeah, I can't hear you, but instead of toggling in and out of the presentation, I just wanted to throw that out there. So if you want to type something in the chat box, but I thought about that too. Our experiences and our age and what we go through, and even how our legal and, political systems impose certain mandatory learning milestones that we kind of have to, go through on our daily basis. So if you hadn't thought about that, maybe I just said, oh, maybe that would be interesting for you guys to consider too. So some of those external factors that kind of force us to grow up and learn in a different way. So that might be something worth looking into if any of you are interested in that aspect of learning. Okay, so moving along, thank you for sharing. Please, if you want to share anything else, feel free to type it in the box. I love your comments and I love your participation. So I took this from page 21 of our textbook. I don't expect you guys to have the textbook out or anything, but if you want to make a reference. I think McDonald's breakdown of learning theories is really helpful. So I've kind of tried to organize it on this slide a little bit for you, because there's so many names and so many theories, and God knows we're not going to get through every single one of them in this course, but I did want to just go over these real quick to kind of have an idea of what each theory meant. So the behaviorist elemental, let's start with capitulation or Hall. So basically Hall influenced Bruner, which we're going to look at in a little bit. And Hall believed that every person goes through stages in the psychic and somatic senses. So there are 6 senses which follow the evolution scale. So these folks believe that we learn based on our age and our evolutionary process. If any of you have had young children, and when they were babies, you kind of, you look through the different stages of what they should be doing at 1-year-old, and what they were, the oral stage and the anal stage and all these different stages that, the kids go. So it kind of ties into that sort of thing. And Hall believed that children develop best when they're not forced into constraints, but they're given the freedom to kind of grow and discover. So it's really the first taste of discovery learning that we see early on in life. And he really had specific, I don't expect you to remember any of this, but he really, set stage for at the age of 8, up to the age of 8, the child should be able to express what he called animal emotion. So kind of like, really frustration, or, they throw a whatever because they're angry, and, that whole use your words type of thing. So, that's what he was getting to. But once you hit the age of 8, that's a whole different ballpark. That is when our brain should be able to fully absorb, symbols and meaning and what things mean behind. So when your kids or, your siblings, your little nephews and nieces ask, what does kindness mean, or what does caring mean, or what does respect mean? Those words that we use every day. And you're like, oh, my daughter's at that stage right now. She's 5. She's 5 going on 12, and she asks me things that are very difficult for me to kind of, we use them every day. Yeah, I respect others. But what does respect mean? And you're like, so yeah, so he really focuses on that age of 8, and then after the age of 8, he really believes that adolescence begins at the age of 8, which is kind of, I think, in today's society makes a little bit more sense, because kids, they're learning stuff younger and younger, and we have less control over what they're exposed to. So yeah, he really believed that coeducation should no longer be, as a child, should no longer be allowed, because, the whole, telling the kid what to do and how to do it, but that they should be able to, interact with different types of kids, of members of the opposite sex, and kind of figure out, what's right and what's wrong. So that's really interesting. So the whole idea of that biology and maturity as a part of learning. Then we look at Thorndike and connectivism. And connectivism and Thorndike's ideas state that learning is achieved when an individual is basically able to form associations between a particular stimulus, and a response. So many of you probably studied Pavlov's dog, right? When the dog is shown, a specific type of food, he salivates. So that's what connectivism is, how we react to the things we encounter on an everyday life. And he defined these as habits. They could be good habits or bad habits, but nevertheless, they're always encouraged by and determined by external parameters. So it's almost like we really have no control over certain types of learning. Certain types of learning is instinctual, and he believed that, his laws highlighted the importance of rewards and emphasis on the necessity to practice repetition. So that old school, practice and practice and practice. And while that's very valid and certain, in a skill, like if you're learning how to play guitar, you're learning how to play piano, practice, practice, practice makes perfect. He generalized it to encompass, a lot of different aspects of our life. And he actually devised what's called the law of effect. So that's Thorndike's idea, the fact that you are intrinsically connected, and we have little control over our responses when we see certain stimuli. And I'm sure some of you can see why it's problematic, and we're not going to get into that tonight, but something for you guys to think about. Then McDonald breaks it up into the holistic, or the different important figures in holistic learning, or her holistic philosophy or psychology. And we start with Dewey, the father of pragmatism, and motivation, and the whole motivation of the child, and how the child is motivated intrinsically. And Dewey really viewed knowledge as arising from active adaptation of the human organism to its environment. So really we start to see those existentialistic kind of like theories that we get in the mid 1900s, starting from Dewey, fairly early. And we start to, understand why certain, back in the, if you remember your old days in philosophy, that whole body and mind dichotomy, and I think by today's standards, I think most of us, went to yoga or New Age or even spirituality, we believe that our mind and our body is connected. So Dewey was really the first person, or not the first, but I'm going to say the first symbolic, person in psychology and educational realm to really reject that whole idea of epistemology versus metaphysics, or reality or knowledge versus intuition. And he called his pragmatism cultural naturalism, meaning humans know the way organisms evolve and our capacities for ability to think. And he thought that once we learned how to speak language, we were able to cope with problems. Now, that's a really simplistic way of looking at learning by today's standards, because, language could be you can look at language as, coding is a language, language is a language, the way nonverbal communication is a language. So it becomes a little bit more, deep when we start looking at it and analyzing it. But basically, our minds are not passively observing the world when we can communicate. We're actually, experimenting and innovating, and we're really interacting with stimuli once we're able to discuss it and share our feelings about it. Then we get into Kurt Lewin, Gestalt theory, field theory, and discovery theory. I don't know if it's still part of the HED program, but there's, the Higher Education Administration program. I think most of you are in that program, or taking courses in or so. I remember taking this course, and I read Systems Thinking by Kurt Lewin as part of my studies, and I absolutely fell in love with this. And this is really the beginning of organizational psychology. Lewin is the father of organizational psych. And he believed that people behave based on the needs of their environmental factors. So basically the way, the benefits, not only like insurance and days off we get in our job, but the cultural benefits of working at a particular institution really is what drives us. And the way that the different systems in an institution work together, that human resources is tied into our medical benefits, and then human resources has activities that really, make our work-life balance, better, and things like that, so that everything is interconnected. And that everything is moving towards a general goal that's bringing everyone together versus separating everyone. And one of his famous, ideas was this whole freeze, change, unfreeze, which is very tied into system thinking. Maybe some of you have heard of it, but it's basically the idea that when something's not going right, the best thing to do is stop everything, stop what you're doing, right? Change whatever needs to be changed, and then unfreeze, okay, and see how it goes. And of course, these theories are not perfect by default, any of them, but that's kind of a neat way of thinking of change and change theory. And he was really interested in Gestaltism, and basically Gestaltism is the theory that everything, it's not just one part of the human psyche that is affected, or influenced by our stimuli and learning, but all of us, our physical being, our mental being, our spiritual being. And it takes holistic learning and psychology to an extreme. And then it focuses on not only our individual, but also where we live in our space and the way we perceive reality, not as an objective viewpoint. Another interesting form of research that many of you, if you're in education or your teachers, you may have had to do a practicum, action research, right? Going in the classroom and doing research while you're actually involved in the process or in the environment. So that's also important to think of. I think most of you grasp what psychoanalysis is, the idea that our subconscious, our unconscious mind is very much active in our everyday life, and things that we don't think influence us really do influence us. I think that's very much a common, I think most of us would kind of subscribe to that to a certain extent. So jumping right into functionalism, which is a little bit less, talked about on an everyday basis. Functionalism was a reaction to a movement called structuralism. And I know these isms, but, structuralism was really the first school of psychology focused on breaking down the mental processes into much more basic components. So researchers tried to understand these basic components of the unconscious using a method known as introspection, right? Self-reflection, look in yourself, break yourself down, figure out why you do the things you do. But it's a very subjective process. Like, we're in it all by ourselves. We don't have a lot of interaction with other folks. So functionalism kind of like slapped that in the face and saying, no. Rather than focusing on just the elements of consciousness, functionalists focus on the purpose of consciousness and behavior, why we think the way we think, why we behave the way we behave. So not just figuring out, why, we think, but the reasons behind it. So not just, that we don't like ice cream because, we don't like chocolate ice cream because we were fed chocolate ice cream every single day of our lives as kids, but rather, why were we fed chocolate ice cream every single day of our lives as kids? Maybe that was the only the type of ice cream that our parents could afford, so that sort of thing. So, looking at ourselves in a more holistic and not just trying to like we're a mathematical problem trying to be solved, but rather that there's reasons behind why we do the things we do. And a reflex, this was the beginning of reflex theory. Reflexes are made possible by neurological pathways, right? And they can act on impulse before impulse reaches the brain. So sometimes the way we react to things, we don't think before we act. When we see, a child running into the street, well, we run and we try to grab that child before he or she runs into the street and gets hurt. Which takes us to Bruner, and I know I'm moving a little quickly, but I know it's getting late and we have quite a few things to cover. So I want to get into Bruner. Bruner's a huge, a person in our studies here in motivation and adult learning. And Bruner was really concerned in the 1960s how knowledge is represented and organized through different modes of thinking, or representation. And one of these modes of thinking is called constructivism. And another way of looking at constructivism is discovery learning. We construct the meaning of things by finding more things out about the thing we're trying to learn. Learners construct their own knowledge by doing things, by organizing and categorizing information in coding systems. So our brains, way before computers were the biggest, where the brains are the most sophisticated computers that exist, but before computers and computer language ever existed, our brain is coding information and compartmentalizing it into little cabinets in our mind. So everything having to do with religion or spirituality, it's kind of in a little part of our life. Anything having to do with maybe our emotion or relationships in a little part of our mind. So Bruner believed that a most effective way to develop a coding system is to discover rather than being told where that coding system belongs. So you might encounter a piece of information and it might seem that it belongs in one compartment, but it really belongs in the compartment that you feel it's most relevant in. And his research on cognitive development of children, Jerome Bruner posed the three modes of representation, and those are the ones that we see in our readings for the week. An active representation, which is basically physical needs when they're babies until about the age of 1. Again, a little bit of biology involved in this one too, but not the main focus of it. Iconic, the ability to be able to sense, different icons and different that a stop sign means stop, or that a crossbones mean poison, that kind of thing. And then our symbolic representation. So how we interpret symbols and, spirituality and thinking, religion, philosophy, those types of thinking. And then language development is also essential. So all these, psychologists also believe that our words, and that's what semiotics, right? Semantics, I'm sorry. semantics, the study of words and their meanings and their interpretation. That's the whole field of study that's come out, something, sort of like from Bruner's ideas and his philosophy. So the idea that knowledge is constructed rather than innate. Okay, we build our knowledge through independence from what we see every day. It's an active process, right? We are active in the way that we acquire information, not just being given. That's sometimes I criticize public school system because there's too much of this passive learning, not questioning. The kid is told to memorize these things, and because it's going to be tested on it, and that's what happens. So that whole active learning, the fact that of course knowledge is socially constructed. Another psychologist you guys might want to look up is Vygotsky. In 1978, he put out his theory, and he believed that the community, starting this whole idea of community existentialism, plays a central role in the process of making meaning. For Vygotsky, the environment in which children grow up will definitely influence, what they think and how they feel. And it's the whole thing of it takes a village. We're seeing it here in our material for this week. Knowledge is very personal, and of course, learning exists in the mind. The constructivist theory posits that knowledge can only exist within the human mind, and that it doesn't have to match any real world, stimuli necessarily. Like, we know what we know in our minds, and we can learn something and understand it without necessarily having to relate it to anything in real life. So that's the whole idea and the belief of intuition. So next week in module 2, we'll see a little bit more about Bruner and his influence on behavioral psychology of Piaget, Bloom, and others. Humans learn in an evolutionary manner, and how they focused on cognition. So Bruner, in a nutshell, we absorb information, we organize it and compartmentalizing, that's a mouthful, in our own ways, not necessarily the way our teachers want us to compartmentalize it, or the way that society tells us we should learn something and relate it to a specific thing. We decide how we use information. We explain or teach information once we understand it, and then we learn to critique or consider alternatives to that information once we mature in our learning process. Finally, we get to Ganji. And again, I'm talking about Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy because I think as educators, we've been hammered with Bloom's. Well, all these guys, Bruner and Ganji, and I say guys because they definitely were guys. Unfortunately, there's more guys than gals, influenced Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy, which we use every day. And there is an updated Bloom's taxonomy for the digital age. If you guys haven't checked it out, you might want to. Where Ganji believed, just similar to the predecessors, that learning is based on a complexity of the mental process. He suggested that the system of analyzing different conditions or levels learning, we needed to learn from the simple to the complex. So we needed to learn how to move first before we need to speak. And we needed to speak in order to understand what we thought. And we needed to learn how to think in order for us to be able to understand what we're thinking. And then finally, we needed to understand what we're thinking in order to have an opinion or an attitude on it. According to Ganji, the higher order of learning is in the hierarchies built upon lower levels. And if any of you have seen those pyramids, and the pyramids I'm going to bring up in a couple of slides, we'll get more into the pyramids next week in better context. I might actually use the same slides because the pyramids are actually really good. It's progressively. You can't jump from memorization to analysis. Memorization is typically the first, recalling information, basically memorizing information, the definitions of words, things like that, lower order thinking. You can't jump from one to the other. You need to learn one set of subordinate skills before you get into the higher order of learning. And then the lower 4 orders focus on behavioral aspects of learning. Again, that whole idea of memorizing and recalling and identifying and memorizing those multiplication tables, before you can get to word problems and algebra kind of thing, before being able to do higher levels of problem solving and learning. These are the pyramids that I absolutely love. Again, Bruner and Ganji were influences of Bloom, and we're going to look at this a little bit more detail, but these are the 3 domains of educational perspectives. Educational objectives and goals. So if any of you are I think most of you are educators, whenever you're writing, goals and objectives. You know, I'm an instructional designer, and my job is to make sure that every single class that I design is taking into consideration alignment between the course objectives and what the students are doing every week in their modules. You know, when I designed this course, that was extremely important to me. You need to know exactly what you're going to get out of the course, and you need to know exactly, if you look at the module objectives in my course, you'll see that every single thing in those module objectives is very specific to the things that you're going to be doing in that week, for the activities, for the papers, whatever it is, the discussion boards. So that's the alignment. And in a good course, if you take a good course or you design a good course, you move in, again, these from lower order to higher order. And if you're a director of an academic program, you start the same thing. You start with the basics and you move into the 1,000 levels to the 4,000 levels, that sort of thing. So, and the three different domains are the cognitive, our minds, our affective, right? The way that we grow in feelings or emotional areas or attitudes. So cognitive being our mental skills, affective meaning our emotional areas, and then our psychomotor, which is our manual or physical skills. So basically the ability to create a project, to create a website, to develop like you did for your video, like a self-reflective video where you actually created, but you needed to know, first of all, who you are. You have to have a self-concept. You needed to know something. You needed to find something, hopefully if you did the assignment correctly, you found a place or a situation where you felt represented who you are, extremely abstract, right? And then you needed to actually take the video and make sure that everything around you aesthetically was okay and was appropriate for an assignment. So again, it seemed to be a very simple and fun, and why am I doing this silly assignment? Maybe some of you thought that, but now you know why, because you were going from something very fun and basic to something very deep and specific, that took you from the lower level, understanding, what the assignment is, then to a higher level, who you are and how you feel yourself represented, and then actually producing that representation to me. So some of the things we'll talk about next week are what are some of the key differences between these categories. Where may you apply this knowledge at school or work? So maybe in the next week or so, when you're speaking to those students or you're working with those students in that lab, you'll be able to see the progression. Or if you're developing an assignment or an exam, looking at, okay, what do they need to know first in order for them to be successful? So if you have an exam that nobody really does well on, or a lot of students have issues with, that might be an issue. You might need to go and review those lower order skills and make sure that basic knowledge that they understand. And I just wanted to throw this in here for you guys to be able to refer to, maybe when you're listening to the presentation, you can freeze it and take a screenshot. I use this when I design my courses, for Quality Matters. Some of you that are in education have heard of Quality Matters. It's really the standard in higher education for online learning. And I use this wheel all the time, not only in my own courses when I'm developing assignments for you guys, but also when I'm training faculty on how to design assignments and course material for their own students, and whenever they're developing those learning objectives, they love the word understanding. Well, understanding is we need to be measurable. They need to be measurable. Well, understanding is not measurable. Remembering is not measurable. Creating is not measurable. So I love this wheel because it takes you from the unmeasurable, like understanding, to actually an act that they're going to produce, something they're going to do, and a deliverable that they're going to be able to give you that is tangible and that is measurable. So if you want to I really encourage you to just, like I said, take a screenshot of this, when you're reviewing the lesson. If you want, I could upload this to the course. I think it's fantastic. And it's such a great image to actually just keep on your desk, print it out, and just refer to it when you're trying to figure out what you want the students to do for a particular project. Maybe you're sick and tired of the paper and the research paper. Well, here are some other options for you to consider when you're designing those assignments for your students. So I know we're a little bit short on time. So some reflection questions that I'm going to kind of leave you with, and we'll pick this up next week. We're going to pick up with Bloom. We're going to talk about Bloom. We're going to talk about the history of andragogy and all that fun stuff, all those Greeks and Romans and the church and all that good stuff. And then we're going to really spend some time on Bloom, but kind of see the connection between the theory and the practice in Bloom's learning wheel. Like I just gave you an example of an assignment, okay? Think of an assignment that you currently have in your class now or in your training session, or your faculty development if you're a development manager, and see what you can tweak in that particular assessment or activity to kind of make it more tangible, make it more measurable for you to really see if the students understand or not. And then think about why you as practitioners, care about theory, and relate it to maybe an example of your life, like you guys gave a few examples earlier today. And then, of course, we're going to be reflecting on some of the learning points, but really that number one, the connection between theory and practice and Bloom's learning wheel is really where you should focus. It's probably the most important and the deepest part of Bloom and the lesson related to Bloom that you really want to take away. It's one of the takeaways that you really want to focus on for this particular lesson in class. Okay, so I know we went through a lot of stuff very quickly. You'll be able to watch this and the transcript will be available to you. Zoom is fantastic. It gives you a transcript, which I like because WebEx is not really friendly for our accessible students for accessibility purposes. So once this is ready to go, I'll upload it and you will have access to those transcripts for you to review. So just preview for next week. Our meeting is same time, different day, next November. We're going to look at the history of pedagogy, some learning techniques, of course, a revolution of modern day educational system, which will take us to Bloom and a couple of his colleagues, and of course, the foundation of adult learning theories and the differences between that and pedagogy. And we're going to get into some really fun stuff dealing with arts and sciences and biology in relation to learning and the learning environment. So good stuff coming up, and I did sprinkle some of that in today's lesson, so hopefully it'll be a nice way for you guys to make a bridge or segue into our lesson for next week. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and exit my presentation, and where's my meeting? So if you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and type it in the box. I'm going to stay on in the meeting for a few more minutes. You guys are free to go. I really wish you have a fun and happy and safe Halloween, if you celebrate it or if you don't celebrate it, but have fun and be safe. And again, if you need me, I'm just a few keystrokes away. Okay, so you guys have a great night, and I'll be on for a few more minutes in case any of you want to hang around and ask me any questions. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful week.